Paul has all kinds of ways to refer to the team members. And so sometimes, he does call them apostles at times, some of them. And, I think in some ways I think many of them are apostles, they're apostolic missionaries. But that was not the normal usage that Paul used. He refers to them as brothers, which, remember, Jesus used the term "my brothers" for those who joined the mission with him. So that's interesting that Paul uses that same one. He does refer to them as sent ones, or which in Greek is apostle. He refers to them as servants of God, fellow servants sometimes. He refers to them as slaves. He himself represented himself as a slave of Jesus Christ. I have submitted my whole life to him. And so these are people who are that committed and submitted to Jesus Christ. He refers to them as partners. He talks about them being workers. He refers to them as being soldiers. We're all soldiers in the army of Jesus, taking this gospel out. He refers to them as fellow prisoners when they have been so active in their ministry that they've gotten in trouble and been thrown in prison. And again, he refers to them as fellow workers. Now, those are not all the designations that he uses, but there's some of the common ones. And again, I don't think that he's making great distinctions, and certainly not some kind of hierarchy here. These are just descriptive words for the people who were joining in the task with him. Now, we see from the story that some of these teammates stayed with Paul for years and years. Timothy would be one of the best examples of that. Maybe almost 20 years, Timothy is in and out with Paul, being sent over here, coming back, joining the team, but always sort of circling around Paul and the ministry, even though they weren't together in the same city all the time. Others, though, joined the team and worked with Paul for a while, and then, based on the story we see, they went off and worked separately. And three of those, all very prominent leaders in the book of Acts, are Barnabas. I don't think Barnabas and Paul hated each other when they went their different ways. I think they just had different approaches to ministry and different priorities, what they felt like they should go do. Silas goes with Paul for a while, and then it appears he's gone off to continue this ministry somewhere else. And Apollos is like that. They know each other, but Apollos doesn't. Paul recognizes him as a partner and a fellow worker, a fellow servant of God. But there's not a lot of time that they were both in the same place, and that may be because both of them were primarily, proclaimers, and so they're looking for another place to go where the gospel's not known. And so when we go through, survey the New Testament and start trying to make a list of these, different scholars will come up with slightly different numbers, but it is very definitely over 36 individuals that are mentioned in Acts and the epistles who worked on this team as a part of this team. Some of them itinerating like Paul was going from place to place, and others, it appears, that he refers to, they are certainly partners, they're part of this same purpose. Maybe most of their ministry is going to be focused in the city where they've come to Christ and they're continuing their ministry in that place. But I don't know about you, but the first time, I see this list and see how many people it is, it's sort of astonishing. We normally, in any of the books or in a chapter in Acts, we might get introduced to 2 or 3 of them at a time, and we lose track of the fact that this is quite a large team of individuals who, many of them have been led to Christ by Paul, discipled by Paul, and now they're continuing the purpose that Paul had to preach the gospel to all the nations and establish churches in every city. No wonder the ministry was growing. Paul is now reproducing not just believers, but workers. And that's a critical issue, even in missions today. Some of those, again, that we know very well by name would be Barnabas, and we see him primarily in Antioch and in Cyprus and in Galatia for several chapters there in the middle of the book of Acts. Silas then comes and joins him, and they go to Macedonia and Achaia. They're getting over into, basically the Greek Empire and, the heartland of Greek culture there. And then Silas goes off. I don't think he stops the ministry. He just maybe is forming a team somewhere else. Timothy joins them, a fairly young man, a fairly new believer, but we already see the church sees potential in him, and so he is with them through Macedonia and Achaia, and then back to Asia later on. And again, we think of the Paul-Timothy relationship as something very special. I think it was. Then we get, the physician, Dr. Luke, joins them, and in Acts we sort of know this when he joins them, because all of a sudden he's not saying they went here and they did this. He's saying we went there, and that includes Antioch and Macedonia. Then we get Aquila and Priscilla, who have an unusual relationship because they shared a profession with Paul, and it appears that they may have been quite good at running the business of leatherworking, as well as probably tradesmen in their own right. So Paul sometimes joins them actually in making their living together in some of these cities. And we know that they are leading house churches, the church that meets in your house, mentioned several times about them. And that includes in Corinth, in Ephesus, and in Rome, it appears. Then we get Titus, and we connect with Titus, seeing him in Antioch, in Corinth, in Crete, and probably in Dalmatia, though that's not described, but it appears that's likely true. And then we have Epaphras, who probably led to the Lord by Paul in Ephesus, and then he, on Paul's behalf, he says, he goes to Colossae, his hometown, and he preaches the gospel and plants the church in Colossae. So all of these are some of the better known members, and including this one who pops up repeatedly but doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, in our story, in a sense. Seems to be less known. But Tychicus was a person who seemed to be trustworthy to send off somewhere else on a mission, and Paul had the confidence in him that he was going to go, maybe by himself, and accomplish this purpose in places like Colossae and Ephesus and Crete. So those, again, are some of the better known team members. But there are many others that we may not hardly even recognize their names that are mentioned at least once, either in Acts or the epistles. Now that's Achaicus, Andronicus, Apphia, Apollos. Obviously I'm doing this in alphabetical order. Archippus, Aristarchus, Clemens, Crescens, Demas, Epaphroditus, Erastus, Euodia, Fortunatus, Junius, Jesus Justus, John Mark, Mary, Onesimus, Quartus, Persis, Philemon, Phoebe, Sosthenes, Stephanas, Syntyche, Trophimus, Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Urbanus. Oh my goodness. And Paul knows all of these people personally and knows what they're doing. That's That's a pretty big team, actually. That's getting sort of like an unwieldy team, except again, a lot of these people are functioning most of the time on their own, but still connected, and Paul still considers them a part of his ministry. So what are some of the team roles then of these people? What were they doing? Were they just, following along behind Paul carrying the scroll? Or no. We get much more active than that. They were really full ministers in the gospel alongside Paul. So let's just walk through a few of the things. We do know in multiple places that there were one or two or maybe more of these people who are with Paul in the same place, working alongside of him and assisting Paul. And I think in a number of places where the ministry seems to go quite quickly, it's largely because Paul wasn't doing this by himself. There were others who were proclaiming the good news and making disciples, on a daily basis in the same city where Paul was. There are cases where one of these stays behind when Paul himself was leaving to go somewhere else, which we know often took place because he got run out of town. Or maybe, again, he felt like things were in good hands here. I'm going to keep going and go to a place where that hasn't heard yet. So these people are extending the length of the ministry in places where they're continuing the work after Paul has gone. There are cases where they seem to have been sent to a new city Paul has not been to yet in order to start a church. So essentially they're doing the model Paul has shown them. They're going to go and preach and disciple people and then form them into a church in the same mode that Paul was doing. And then, the numerous times that Paul is in prison, whether in more of a dungeon-like place or whether he's under house arrest, they're out both in that city and other places continuing the ministry because Paul is there in prison. And they may be connecting with him and dialoguing with him constantly. He's keeping up and giving some direction and praying for the ongoing ministry of the team while he can't move around. A number of times we see, now sometimes Paul went back to check on a church that he had planted on a previous trip, but we also see a number of cases where one of the team members goes back to check on a church that at that particular time Paul was too busy or not free to go check on. And we see them doing church planting separately from Paul in some cases. I'm not sure how many of them, but actually some of them seem to be forming their own team and probably following this same projection separately from Paul. And then something that we have a tendency to, I think, underemphasize, the scriptures tell us, the letters themselves tell us that several of Paul's letters were not really just Paul's letters. They were written by the team alongside of Paul. And again, I think there's a tendency for us as individualistic Westerners, those of us who are individualistic Westerners, to think, oh, well, these other people didn't really contribute to that letter. No, I think that they did, and in some cases, slight changes in wording and other things like that from letter to letter may show the influence of, some of those other people who are in the process of somehow writing. This was actually common in the Greek world at that time. There were individual letters, and then there were letters that were sent from a small group, and that group had input into what was going into the letter. So those are all, that's 7 really important things that the team is doing, all around Paul and sometimes over in another place where they've been sent. Well, okay, so there are a lot of men on this team. We saw a lot of those names earlier were men, though surprising number of women also. We'll get to that in a minute. So let's just look at a couple of the examples of men's roles. This is not intended to be a determinative list and, oh, well, they had to only do these things, but they're just examples, okay, that we see in the record that we have. In 1 Corinthians 16, we see that Stephanas and his household were the first to believe, and that it seems that in an unusual way they had committed themselves to serve the Lord. That might be something like we would think of as full-time. Not sure that they were fully supported, but anyway, the whole household had completely given themselves, and Stephanas, obviously the leader of his household, they are serving the Lord. And then we get Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus came to Paul to supply what was lacking. Now, some people might think that that's finances. I don't think so in the context of Corinthians, that means finances. More likely it's encouragement and messages from the churches and those kinds of things, and prayer together and those kind of, more of an encouraging, we're all together in this kind of role that they did. But that's just a couple of things mentioned right here in 1 Corinthians. Then in Acts 16, we see, again, Paul chose Timothy, who is a new believer, but a respected new believer. The young church had seen this transformation and potential in him. And so Paul chose him to join his team. And then Timothy functions as a part of that team for a long time, maybe till the end of Paul's life. Then in Colossians, Paul refers to Epaphras, who's gone to Colossae to plant the church there. And Paul says it's on behalf of his team. So this was something intentional. There's probably a sense of being sent there. Maybe Epaphras was involved in the ministry in Ephesus after he came to Christ and just kept saying, perhaps, I need to go home and share the gospel with the people in the city of Colossae. And that team may have, maybe even almost formally sent them off, certainly praying for him and keeping in touch with him during that time period. And then we get to Titus, where Paul mentions that he has left Titus. So Paul was there in Crete with him at some point. Most likely after the story of Acts stops. We don't know the end of the story from Acts. It just stops. And so Paul left Titus in Crete, and according to Paul, to set in order what remains. The people have come to faith. They've probably been at least initially discipled, but the church is not yet fully mature. So Titus stays to develop and deepen the church and lead it to the next level. And that includes, the most important thing is then to appoint leaders. Now, I think that the churches were involved in that process. These, like when we read Timothy and Titus, and we have the descriptions of what a leader is sent to those young members of the missionary team, they knew what leaders were supposed to be. But these letters were read to the whole church in those places too. So it's a teaching moment for the whole church to be involved. But Titus is certainly there to lead this process of identifying who God is calling out to be the key leaders of these churches. Now, once that's taken place, there's no hint in the New Testament that the missionaries keep doing that, the next time the church needs leaders. They are there. I think their role largely, they start transitioning out once a local leader is in place. They still encourage him, perhaps, and other things. But now he's the one God has chosen and raised up to be the leader of that church.